You're about to hear a message from the series, What Kind of Man Is This? By Phil Brainerd. In this session, we'll learn that Jesus is Lord of the future. We hope you enjoy it. We're going to start the day by looking at some cave paintings. We've all seen pictures of those since elementary school. Cave paintings tell us about the past. They represent life long ago, sometimes tens of thousands of years. The artists, if we can call them that, wanted to represent things they saw in their lives. What kind of things did people do in those days? Well, oftentimes they hunted. In that case, we see pictures of animals and people with spears and arrows. Most of these paintings have something in common. They describe daily things in the lives of our ancestors, so they're informative and interesting. But normally they're not life-changing. It doesn't really surprise us that cave people hunted for a living. Every now and then, though, we run into a cave painting that represents something big. In a moment, we'll talk about one. It was discovered in a cave in Indonesia, and it is thought to be more than 30,000 years old. In this painting, we simply see some hands. But these are not just any hands. These hands are doing something unique, something special. These hands represent a major change in civilization. Imagine the scene. 30,000 years ago, some cavemen are sitting around a fire. They're discussing a problem that they're facing. Someone makes a suggestion about handling the problem. Then, a few people raise their hands. These hands. A man stands up in the midst of that gathering of early humanity. For the first time in all of human history, the person utters the following immortal words. But we've never done it that way before. Everyone knew that this was a first, so this cave painting was created to commemorate that event. You're not buying that, huh? Actually, it's probably some individuals who figured out that they could put their hands against the wall and draw lines around it. So it's interesting, and it was a first of sorts. It's just not earth-shattering. We've never done it that way before. In modern days, we hear those words quite often. They represent old thinking. Sometimes old thinking is good, but sometimes not so much. We're going to read a story today where old thinking was decidedly bad. We're in our series, The King and I. Matthew tells us about the King of the universe. We're learning about Jesus by working our way through Matthew's book about his life. We're in a sub-series right now entitled, What Kind of Man Is This? Today we're going to learn that Jesus is Lord of the future. Let's read about it. The first thing we're going to see is that some of John's disciples were present, and they have a question. We're reading in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 14. Then John's disciples came and asked him, How is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Let's recall the context. In our last session, Jesus called Matthew to follow him, and Matthew followed. After accepting the invitation to follow Jesus, Matthew invited Jesus and his disciples to his home. Matthew, as you recall, was a tax collector. If someone chose to be a tax collector in those days, it was because it was a way to make a lot of money. Because of this, Matthew probably lived in a home that was comparatively expensive. When they arrived at his home, Matthew hosted a big dinner and invited all his friends. Matthew's circle of friends was made up of other tax collectors. Because most of the people at the party made good money, they could afford good food and drink, and lots of it. Maybe some music, too. Also at the party were some of the disciples of John the Baptist. Let's compare what John's followers saw at the party with the way that John the Baptist lived. We met John earlier in Matthew's book in chapter 3. Let's read in verse 1 and then verse 4. In those days John the Baptist came, preaching in the wilderness of Judea. John's clothes were made of camel's hair, and he had a leather belt around his waist. His food was locusts and wild honey. So we see here that John the Baptist lived out in the wilderness. That means he had no beautiful home. He wore clothes made out of camel's hair. In another place, Jesus tells us that this was not an expensive, comfortable outfit. That's over in Matthew chapter 11. When John eats, he eats very simple fare. His protein comes from locusts. They were the only kosher insect. In other words, John ate bugs. There was no refrigeration in those days, so John and his friends had to hunt around every day for fresh bugs to eat. Apparently, locusts don't taste all that good by themselves. John and others like him made the bugs edible by dipping them in wild honey. Understand, if you were out in the wilderness, you didn't go to the store and buy a jar of honey. This is not Winnie the Pooh. You had to hunt around to find honey. Along the way, you probably had to shoo away some bees. And if you didn't shoo them away quite correctly, you might get stung. So John lived outside in the wilderness. He wore cheap, not terribly comfortable clothing, and he ate simple food that he had to search for every day. If you were one of John's followers, you likely did the same. Because of this, we can assume that when John's followers looked at the party in Matthew's home, they had a "what's wrong with this picture" moment. Matthew lived in an expensive home. Matthew and his friends wore expensive, comfortable clothing. They ate the best food available, and lots of it. To make things even more interesting, John taught his disciples to fast. To fast, of course, is to give up eating for a while. Now, we know that Jesus had problems with the Pharisees, likely John did too. But one thing the Pharisees and John's followers had in common was fasting. All of this adds up to confusion for John's followers. So they ask, how is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Notice not only do John's followers and the Pharisees fast, but they fast often. We're not sure about John's disciples, but many of the Pharisees would fast at least 1 or 2 days a week. Jesus will answer this question in 3 parts. Before we look at his answer, let's make a point. Jesus saw John's followers as legitimate. The Pharisees didn't like Jesus, and it showed up whenever they asked questions. When they asked questions, most times they were not looking for answers. They were just trying to make Jesus trip up. John's followers, on the other hand, were sincere. Because of that, Jesus will give them a friendly answer. If Jesus didn't like these men, he could have started by embarrassing them. He could have started by asking the following question. Before I give you the answer to your question, tell me, why do you fast? If Jesus had done that, I'm suspicious that he would have received a lot of blank looks. At some point, someone would have had to admit the following. Come to think of it, we don't really know. We just have always fasted. In other words, we've always done things that way. From that point on, the men could have tried to guess at why they fasted, but instead of wasting time and instead of embarrassing these sincere but uninformed men, Jesus gives them the answer that they need. Again, the answer has 3 parts. Each part contains a picture. First, a groom and his wedding party. Next, an old garment that needs a patch. Finally, new wine and old wineskins. Let's take a look at these 3 pictures. First, we see a picture from a wedding, a groom and his wedding guests. We read in Matthew 9 and verse 15. Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast." I love weddings, don't you? They're beautiful. As a minister, it's even more of a joy because I get to stand up in front with the couple. If the only thing that happened at a typical wedding was the ceremony, weddings would be wonderful. But as you know, there's often more. There's the celebration. There's music. There are festivities. And of course, there's food. In the days of ancient Israel, here's how weddings were set up. The bride and the groom became engaged. This involved a small ceremony. The groom had the responsibility of preparing a home for his new family, so he went off to do that. It might take a month. It might be several months. It might be longer. Along with preparing a home, the groom also prepared the wedding celebration. When it was time, the groom would grab some of his best friends and return for his bride. Now, after the engagement, the bride went back to her home. Her job was to wait. She was to be ready because the groom could come at any time. All she had to do was be ready. Remember, Jesus is talking to followers of John the Baptist, so he's creating an illustration tailor-made for them. John told all his followers that his job was to prepare people for the arrival of the Messiah, Everyone in Israel waited for centuries for that day. And guess what? The Messiah came, and he was Jesus. That's what John the Baptist told his followers. So the time during which Jesus walked on the earth could be compared to a wedding. Technically, it all should have been a big celebration. In actuality, Matthew was doing exactly what he should be doing. The Messiah came, so Matthew celebrated with a big party. So, what is Jesus saying to John's followers? He's telling them that they are living in the past. He's telling them that they haven't thought about what's happening around them in the present. Jesus is the Messiah. Previously, the Messiah had not yet arrived, so people acted in a certain way. Now the Messiah was there. Things change when the Messiah is walking the earth. But there's more. Jesus asked, how can the guests of the bridegroom mourn? How can they mourn when he is with them? The guests of the bridegroom are his friends. Hopefully. In the real world, not always, but let's go with that idea for this illustration. So if the bridegroom is there, his friends are happy. If the bridegroom is not there, his friends are something less than happy. Are you following? The further the bridegroom, the more unhappy his friends become, until they mourn. So the friends of the bridegroom want to be close to him, as close as possible. So now we get to the original question about fasting. The proper way to word the question is not, why don't you fast? The proper question is, why do people fast? What's the reason? And Jesus tells us people fast when they mourn. There are many times recorded in the Bible when people fasted, but you know what? There was only one time in the Old Testament when people were clearly commanded to fast. That was the Day of Atonement. It was a very special day, one day a year, when Moses told the people to remember their sins. On that day, they were to fast. No food and no water. They were supposed to avoid work. People were to spend an entire day remembering their sins. And for those who seek God, sins cause them to mourn. Why? The prophet Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 59 and verse 2. He says there, your iniquities have separated you from your God. So once a year, Moses commanded the people to remember their sin. Sin causes separation from God. Because of that, godly people mourn. And because they mourn, they fast. As an act of grace, the last activity on the Day of Atonement was to sacrifice a lamb for the sins of the world. Then people could return to their normal lives. Because their sins were forgiven, at least symbolically, they could draw close to God again. At other times, people mourned because they were in danger of some kind. Queen Esther, for example, called upon the people of Israel to fast when she learned that they were about to be wiped out. The prophet Daniel fasted when he heard that the sins of Israel were going to get them into trouble. So fasting is appropriate on some occasions. But something bad happened along the way. Groups like the Pharisees forgot why people should fast. They forgot because they didn't understand their own sin. They didn't understand that they should be mourning over their sin. So to them, fasting became a way to show off. They showed off to other people. Perhaps they thought they were showing off to God. This made their fasting worthless. The followers of John were different. They were sincere followers of God, but they were misinformed. They didn't realize that something new had arrived. So the words, "we always did it that way before," didn't cut it here. Jesus was warning them to wake up. The Messiah was right there, and he was going to forgive their sins, so they could be close to him without activities like fasting. On the other hand, this wonderful situation would not last forever. Reading on in Matthew 9 and verse 15. The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast. Imagine you're attending a wedding. It's beautiful. There's food and celebration. You're having a wonderful time with the happy couple. But then you hear banging on the door. The door opens, and soldiers in riot gear come storming in. They grab the groom and haul him away. I think there could be some tears if that happened. And that's what happened with Jesus. Now Jesus, after suffering and dying, rose again. He went up to his kingdom and told us he would return someday. But in the meantime, it feels like he is distant, and our sin feels close. And sometimes we're in danger. And so we may sometimes fast, not to show off to others, or certainly not to show off to God, but because we sincerely mourn over our sin. We mourn over our sin and the effect that it has on our lives and on our world. And we fast because it helps us to draw close to God at times when he feels distant. So the followers of John asked why Jesus and his followers didn't fast. Jesus answered with the first picture, a bridegroom and his guests. Jesus told them that fasting had to do with mourning. Mourning is what you do when you are far from God. And there's a hint here. God is close to these men. Why? Because Jesus the Messiah is God. Something very different was happening, and Jesus wanted John's followers to know it. Jesus has more to share. Let's look at the second picture, an old garment that needs a patch. Let's read about that in Matthew 9 and verse 16. Jesus says, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse." In our modern world, most people own more than one outfit. In the days of ancient Israel, most folks were happy if they had one. You had one outfit, so you had to take care of it. If you were lucky, you might start with a new outfit, but over time your garment got old. So let's say you tripped and fell and you got a tear in your outfit. You pulled out the needle and thread and you tried to fix it. If the tear was really bad, you might need a patch. But now we have a problem. The materials of that day tended to shrink a lot. So if you started with a patch made from new material, eventually it would shrink too. And then you would have a worse tear than when you started. Apparently this was common knowledge in those days, so Jesus didn't have much explaining to do after giving the picture. Notice Jesus is using the word old. The implication is there is old and new. If you try to mix them, bad things happen. So what does this have to do with fasting? Well, fasting was just one instance of things going wrong. The Pharisees had all kinds of traditions that perverted the teachings of the Scriptures. Previously, Jesus was very clear about his mission. He was not getting rid of old things that were correct. Back in Matthew 5 and verse 17, we read this, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus isn't telling his followers to throw out everything that's old, just the opposite. He's telling them to make sure they understand the original mission of Israel. Israel was to tell the people of the world about God, and following God has nothing to do with the bad traditions of the Pharisees. Later, the Apostle Paul explained this to his friends who were living in Rome. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, we read this, "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes." Paul, as we just read, was sad for his fellow Israelites. They were zealous, he said, but they weren't doing things the right way. They were trying to create their own righteousness by their works. So when they fasted, they thought they were doing it to create their own righteousness. Paul says, no, something new has arrived. Christ is the culmination of the law. I often remind people of what Paul said over in the book of Ephesians. In Ephesians 2 and verse 8, we read this, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." So Jesus is saying you must work to understand the truth that God gave in the past. You must then understand what God is doing in the present. Then you have something to carry into the future. If you mix old, unscriptural traditions with the truth of the Word, you're going to have a mess. Everything will be torn apart. So if you're going to fast, make sure you understand why. To drive this home, Jesus gives us one more picture. New wine and old wineskins. In Matthew 9 and verse 17. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst. The wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. In the old days, there were two ways to store wine. You could put it into jars. That would be great if you didn't have to move anything, but jars were heavy. If you had to travel with the wine, the best way to store it was to use wine skins. New wine produces gases because it's still fermenting, so you want to put it into something that's going to stretch. Something like a new bag made out of fresh leather. Leather bags were expensive, so it would be tempting to try to reuse the leather once the wine was finished. But then the leather had gotten hard. Because the bag couldn't stretch anymore, putting fresh wine into an old bag would result in an explosion. You would lose both the bag and the wine, again, both of which were very expensive. If you wanted to reuse a leather bag, maybe you could do so with water, just not wine. So once again, Jesus is warning John's followers, and his own, to make sure they understand what's going on. Mixing human tradition with the truths of the Scriptures will get you into a mess. Okay, now that we understand what's going on here, let's ask, what does this mean for us today? As always, it means a lot of things, but let's center on a few. I think most of all we have to ask, do we understand what we're doing? John's disciples were very sincere, but when you really got down to it, they didn't know what they were doing. They were fasting, which is a hard thing to do, but they didn't know why they were doing it. The Pharisees fasted. In their case, their motives were totally wrong. So fasting became one of many things that caused them to be misled. They thought they were earning righteousness. In fact, they were moving further away from God every time they fasted. So how about us? Let's use an easy example, not too threatening. A few years back, our church refurbished the sanctuary. That included painting the walls and installing new carpet. In order to do that, we had to move a lot of things out before we started and then put them back in when we were finished. When we were putting things back, one of the items was a Christian flag. Now, being a minister with some training in church history, I knew why some people might want a Christian flag. However, when I asked around, no one else knew why we had one. Let's just say for now that we didn't need one in our church, so I suggested we put it into storage rather than put it back on display. One person raised their hand and said, "But we've always had it. Will people get upset if we don't put it back?" I said, "Let's find out." Well, it's been more than 5 years, and no one has complained. That's a good example of we always did it that way. Here was something prominently displayed in our sanctuary that added nothing to our worship experience. We could move on to all kinds of things that would be more controversial. However, the list could get long. So let's do this. We'll run into those things as we work our way through the scripture. When we do, we'll just call them wineskin stuff. For now, let's say that we need to be constantly aware of why we're doing things. Let's pull this all together. The words, "We've never done it that way," don't cut it in the 21st century. We must understand the truth of God that we learn in the scriptures, the truth that God gave us in the past. We must be aware of our present world. We must apply the ancient truths to the lives of people today. We must be willing to look at every detail of our ministry. And we must be ruthless in removing things that don't have any purpose, no matter how good they make us feel. We must understand the past. We must apply it to the present. We must remove anything that doesn't fit. Then and only then will we be able to move with confidence into the future. Why do we want to move into the future? Because our Lord Jesus Christ is Lord of the future. You just heard a message by Phil Brainerd. What kind of man is this? Lord of the future. If you want to hear more, come visit us. We're Trinity Church of Teaneck, New Jersey. Our website is trinityteaneck.org, or visit my site, philbrainerd.com. May the Lord richly bless you.